Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, Women's Voices in Climate Action, the Power of Visual Storytelling. Women's leadership is crucial for effective climate action, but policy and planning processes may not create the space for women in all their diversity to meaningfully participate and drive solutions. So in this event, we'll explore the power of visual storytelling in bringing women's voices into climate change adaptation planning processes, especially women from underrepresented groups and communities. We'll showcase visual stories captured by women on the front lines of climate change in Ghana and Kenya, and discuss how these can influence decision-making in NAP processes towards locally led and gender-responsive adaptation action. I'll just introduce myself here at this point. So my name is David Hoffman. I am a policy analyst with the Resilience Program at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which hosts the National Adaptation Plan Global Network. And I'll be your moderator today. Just a few housekeeping points before we get started. So today's session will be 1 hour long. And please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself just by typing your name and affiliation in the chat box. And also note that we are recording this session, so we'll aim to share the video and slides with participants as a follow-up to this webinar. And again, so if you have any questions, comments, or technical issues, just please let us know in the chat box. So let me also briefly introduce the partners that made today's event possible. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, the NAP Global Network is an initiative that works to enhance national adaptation planning and action in developing countries. Funding for the NAP Global Network has been provided by Canada, Germany, Ireland, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Austria. On this pilot initiative, we are thrilled to have partnered with Lensational, a social enterprise that empowers underrepresented women through photography and storytelling training since 2014. And we really greatly appreciate the collaboration with our government partners, the Climate Change Directorate within the Ministry of Environment and Forestry in Kenya, and the Environmental Protection Agency in Ghana. And finally, we are grateful to Global Affairs Canada for the financial support for this initiative. We also have prepared a video. Essentially, internet and technology issues, they make it difficult for us to have our trainees join us directly today. So we've put together a short video to share some of their photos and stories with you, and to give you a sense of how they're being received by policymakers. The majority of the photos you'll see in the video, they are taken by the trainees as part of the project. Others were taken by the Lensational team and the photographers who provided the training for the groups of women. We've also been able to include footage from our first workshop in Nairobi, which took place this Monday. So I'll hand over to Caesar. I'll ask to Caesar, my colleague, to please play the video and enjoy.
Meaningful participation by women who are on the front lines of climate change is essential for gender-responsive, locally led adaptation. National Adaptation Plan processes, or NAP processes, are a key opportunity to facilitate dialogue between adaptation decision makers and the people most affected by the impacts of a changing climate. Over the last several months, the social enterprise Lensational and the NAP Global Network have been working with groups of women in Ghana and Kenya to explore how visual storytelling can be used as a tool for policy advocacy. Equipped with training in storytelling and photography, the participants developed visual stories that capture their experiences with climate change and their visions of resilience. Now, in collaboration with the Environmental Protection Agency in Ghana and the Climate Change Directorate in Kenya, we are bringing their stories to adaptation decision makers in a process of dialogue and shared learning.
Adding this element of empowering women to be part of this initiative is spectacular. And so we see a value in bringing on board women in adaptation plan, especially young girls, through telling stories to depict what climate change has for their lives.
Women in Tamale, Accra, and Ada have differing experiences with climate change. Their stories explore coastal erosion, extreme weather, displacement, and the need for collective action.
A story through a picture can actually say so much. Bringing on board young women to use photographs to depict adaptation will go a long way to enhance Ghana's adaptation profile.
Soon, their stories will be shared with adaptation stakeholders, including government, civil society actors, international organizations, and the media. In Kenya, the stories of Maasai women from the southwest of the country provided adaptation actors with a new perspective on climate change impacts in their communities. Government decision makers and other stakeholders had the opportunity to interact with the newly trained photojournalists to learn from their experiences.
This lady is known as, she's my aunt. She's one of the residents that practices farming as one of the means of living. And in this photo, she's trying to till her bean shamba. As you can see, her bean shamba has been affected by extreme drought, but she goes ahead to till it because it's the only hope that she has.
Maasai woman, or let's say women, are the most affected by this climate change. A Maasai woman is supposed to collect firewood, fetch water for her household and for the livestock, and feeding also the household. So I have to go and collect water and enough water. So I carry my baby in my stomach like this, and then I am carrying a jerrycan, a 20-liter jerrycan on my back, going 10 kilometers. Just imagine how difficult it is.
Their visual stories display the ways in which climate change affects access to water, housing, and food security, and importantly, how these impact the lives of women and the communities they support.
Where I sit as a policymaker, I'm seeing this direct link to what's happening on the grassroots, where the people on the grassroots actually capture the situation and share with the wider audience. It gives the true picture and hence influences how the policymakers should decide their actions, strategies, and policies.
We do not know what is climate change. Experience drought, house dies, lack of water, falling of trees, fallings of trees, and many causes of drought. From the project, I am now aware what have been experienced for many years is climate change.
I'm a meteorologist by profession, and there are so many other ways that we always tell people to adapt, how they can be able to adapt to climate change. Maybe change of cropping, change of livelihoods. But today I've seen that the community itself can be able to manage their own way of adapting to climate change. Our policy on climate change should start from bottom up, going to the grassroots.
This pilot initiative demonstrates the power of visual storytelling to bring different stakeholders together, building a shared understanding of climate change issues and priorities for adaptation. Incorporating this type of approach in national adaptation plan processes can facilitate meaningful participation by people whose voices are often excluded from decision-making. This will help to ensure that adaptation action is gender responsive and locally led, increasing resilience for people of all genders and social groups.
Thank you to all of you who've started introducing yourself in the chat. I hope you enjoyed the video. For today's webinar, we've been able to organize panel discussions. So I'll briefly introduce the different panelists who are our esteemed partners in this for this event, in this program. So with us today, we have Thomas Larentin, who is the Deputy Director of the Climate Change Adaptation Directorate within the Ministry of Environment and Forestry in Kenya. We are also joined by Lydia Kibandi, who is Lensational's CEO. We're also lucky to have Angie Daze, who is a colleague of mine, a Senior Policy Advisor and Gender Equality Lead in the Resilience Team, as part of the NAPGLO Network Secretariat and IISD. And finally, Stella Oko, who joins us from the Climate Change Department in the Environmental Protection Agency in Ghana. So I will ask the panelists to turn on their cameras for this part. And I will start by asking a question to you, Lydia. So yes, to begin with, Lydia, Lensational has been working on visual storytelling with groups of women for a while now, but the element of using the stories for policy advocacy is somewhat new. How do you see the potential of using this going forward?
Thank you, David. And thank you to my fellow panelists and also the amazing guests who are joining us. I believe the idea of advocacy, whether to challenge stereotypes that are associated with gender and particularly women from underrepresented communities and groups, or advocacy in terms of creating a pool of information that can offer evidence and incentives to policymakers to propel or push for change, has always been the end goal for Lensational. And we started to see the need for this with programs, with earlier programs where, apart from women being able to express themselves and share their stories, we realized that real and sustainable change would mean informing policy. However, previously, we had not had the chance to really put that into practice. where we transition from having a pool of information built by the women to having dialogues with policymakers and other stakeholders. And what our partnership with National Adaptation Plan Global Network and also the in-country governments has done is to help us to gain insights on how to then make that transition. And I love when we were discussing this with Angie, who is also in the panel, we agreed that it's such a complementary partnership where we have, as Lensational, we come in with the stories, and National Adaptation Plan provides the network to involve policymakers, and then there are policymakers who effect the change. And now moving on, in terms of even our internal strategy at Lensational, this is one of the key steps that is informing how we develop our program plans from the very inception of our program, where we think about how do we involve policymakers from the very beginning to ensure that we're bridging the gap from the transition of stories to seeing the change that the women desire.
Thank you, Lydia. Let me move on to Angie, and perhaps you can build a bit on some of the points that Lydia raised. My question to you is, why did NAP Global Network see this as an exciting opportunity in relation to NAP processes? So how did NAP Global Network see the project as an exciting opportunity?
Thanks. And yeah, first I just want to agree with Lydia that we have such a complementary partnership with ourselves, Lensational, and the government. So that's been probably the most amazing part of this whole experience. But in terms of why it was exciting for us, so at the NAP Global Network Secretariat, we've worked with more than 50 countries now to advance their NAP processes. And in general, we find that government decision makers actually really want to hear from people on the front lines of climate change, but they face challenges in making the dialogues happen and in finding a common language to talk about climate change, its impacts, and strategies for building resilience. So when we heard about Lensational's approach about working with women to build photography and storytelling skills, we really saw a lot of potential for visual stories to be used as a tool to communicate women's perspectives and promote dialogue on climate change adaptation. And there were a number of aspects of this that were very exciting to us. The themes of vertical integration, so linking local to national adaptation processes, of gender equality and social inclusion, of civil society participation in policymaking. These have really been at the center of our work on NAP processes for quite some time, and we saw this initiative as a way to explore them further. And of course, the opportunity to collaborate with such an innovative partner as Lensational was very appealing. And at the center, we were really interested in exploring how visuals can be used to communicate about climate change and resilience. We see that adaptation is so often framed as a technical issue with a focus on data, technologies, infrastructure, and obviously all of these are really important. But local, traditional, and indigenous knowledge and processes of social change are really, really essential for building resilience. And we think that visual stories provide a way to bring these dimensions to the forefront. And finally, we were really lucky to have our wonderful open-minded partner governments in Ghana and Kenya who were willing to collaborate with us to test the approach on a pilot basis.
Thanks, Angie. Well, let me hand over to them. I'll start with you, Thomas. Hi, Thomas. Hi again. So you had the opportunity to hear and view the stories and to interact with the photographers earlier this week. And let me ask you, what were your impressions from this process? And perhaps also, did it change the way you think about adaptation to climate change?
Thank you very much, David. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, all. Yeah, it's really my pleasure to be here and interact with all of you. Sure, I had a very fantastic experience this week interacting with the photographers and seeing what they've done and appreciating how much knowledge is out there that we need to see as policymakers. because as policymakers, you're supposed to respond to issues, challenges, and problems on the ground. And unless you interact with these problems, then it becomes very difficult to come up with the targeted and responsive policies. So I had a very, very profound experience. It was really, mind-boggling to see how those ladies can capture the stories and also express the stories in a way that really touches you and tells you what's happening. And a picture, gives you like 1,000 words to explain. In one picture, you have all these together. And, for us, as we develop the policies, like the NAP, you have to be, it has to be a very inclusive participatory process. And as much as we try, it's always not possible to reach everyone. But by having these, visual expressions, people capturing these situations on the ground and sharing with you, you'll reach every corner of the country when you're just in your desk. So it's quite innovative, and I think it's the way to go. It's always, sometimes you think you got it all until you encounter such experiences, and you say, wow, so there's another way that we can do this in a better, cost-effective manner. And to me, the local community knows exactly how they're impacted. And it's very important if they're the ones who are telling you how they're impacted and giving you solutions. They're not just there going through these challenges. They also come up with very innovative ways to adapt because they face this hands-on, and they're actually in the front lines of the impacts of climate change. So actually, I found it to be very, very useful. And I thank all of you for being part of this process and for actually bringing this to fore for all of us to see and learn from. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Thomas, for those insights and kind words. Stella, you will be having a dialogue with a group of photographers in Ghana later this week on Friday. What are you looking forward to in this process?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you all from Ghana. I cannot agree with my earlier speakers more, but I am very curious. And then since the focus is elevating women's voices in climate change adaptation, I think I'm looking forward to see these imageries that is women would come out with to tell our stories. I come from a country where you have more women than men. And data have shown that even it's women who are more vulnerable in this climate change and its impacts. Therefore, but you see these people, these women who has more problems are underrepresented when it comes to these issues of climate change adaptation. And so empowering these people, these women in this way to be able to tell stories. Sometimes I say that narratives can be boring. And then I've had the opportunity to see a video before this program. It is giving you real life stories, what it is. So I am expecting to experience something I have not in this climate change process. And then I know that it's going to be an impactful one because even the teaser is telling me that we don't even have a clear representation of what some of the issues are. Just the narratives are not helping. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella, that's great. Lydia, back to you. What was the most exciting or surprising thing you learned through the visual stories developed by the trainees?
I I think perhaps one of the most significant lessons that I have learned, or that's maybe been reinforced through the stories that they shared, is the importance of that personal imprint and of their stories. And I like that that lesson keeps being reinforced even here with the discussion with my panelists, with my fellow panelists, where they're the ones telling the stories and they're the ones who are documenting it. First and foremost, I believe it really offers context-specific details that would otherwise be lost in high-level information if it is presented differently. And the second reason is ownership. The women really feel a sense of ownership to these stories, and they feel that they're in a position to also inform the change that they desire for their communities. I think at Lensational, one of the things that we always observed from previous photos is that although the impacts of climate change are very tangible and they're being felt quite significantly by the groups of women that we work with, they don't feel that they are in a position to do anything. But then when they're the ones being documenting and sharing these stories, they feel a sense of ownership and a sense that they are in position to also be a part of the change that they desire for their communities. And because we walk through with them like the whole journey, just helping them to be able to express themselves, it's really easy for us to feel like we're part of these stories, which is not a bad thing. But when watching them tell their stories and discuss their stories, it really underpinned that these, although we feel like we're a part of it, these are really their stories. And we're simply facilitating the conditions for them to be able to tell them. And they appreciate being able to be the ones who are speaking for themselves. They really just take ownership of that. And the second thing is that I think we always talk about these women being at the forefront of climate change adaptation and planning, of climate change impact, I mean. And when they're the ones speaking, I think ultimately, through that sense of ownership, it really translates to empathy and compassion. And I love that when Thomas talked about it, he said that it leaves you feeling touched. And I think that that's one of the most significant lessons that has come out through them being able to share and tell their stories.
Thanks, Lydia. Angie. Hello. So, Angie, why do you think that this type of dialogue between decision makers and women on the front lines of climate change is important for more effective NAP processes?
Yeah, great question. I mean, so the NAP process was actually established under the UNFCCC back in 2010. And at that time, there were a number of guiding principles that were established. And these included participation, gender sensitivity, use of traditional and indigenous knowledge, and consideration of vulnerable groups and communities. And then since then, we've seen the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan take these ideas even further, emphasizing human rights, indigenous rights, gender equality, and women's empowerment. And so all of these are really essential foundations for adaptation action to be effective if it's going to protect people and livelihoods from climate impacts. So for me, this initiative is about putting the principles of inclusive and gender responsive adaptation action into practice. We know that, national level decision making should be guided by realities on the ground, and the stories that our newly trained photographers have developed are extremely compelling in communicating how climate change is affecting their lives and their communities. But I think even more importantly, they also illustrate women's resilience in the face of these challenges, the ways they're innovating and the ways they're collaborating to protect their families and their communities. And I think what I love is that these stories really push back against the prevailing narrative of women as most vulnerable, showing that they're also powerful agents of change. So to me, these stories point to what's needed for adaptation to be effective: strong social networks that facilitate collective action, access to information and services that help people to manage risks to their livelihoods, and government policies and investments that enable local action to happen. So for me, these are fundamental ideas that countries should be guided by as they approach their NAP processes. And so I think that if we can make these types of dialogues part of NAP processes, that will only make them more effective and more likely to yield equitable outcomes for people on the front lines of climate change.
Thank you so much, Angie. Stella, I have a question for you in relation to the government of Ghana. So Ghana has committed to a gender responsive NAP process. Do you think this type of initiative can help you to achieve this ambition?
Exactly so. This initiative will help, yes, in achieving the ambition, since it's bringing on board an influential initiative, dynamics to the NAP. NAP itself is giving voices to women already to talk about their immediate environment when it comes to climate change. Amplifying those voices is going to go a long way to tell a story with evidence. And for me, the evidential part of it is the most critical. And then the NAP coordinator who shared his video earlier had said how very valuable this innovation is, because it's bringing on board women, and especially younger women, the grassroots, the most affected, to tell these stories. I'll share an experience, the early parts of 90s. Our television stations introduced some telenovelas, which came, and it was not in English. Some language we all did not understand. I can tell you how impactful that was. We had even older women who were following the stories through without understanding the languages that was spoken. And they could even share the stories with others who didn't have the opportunity to watch. And that is where I know this is going to impact even the NAP process, and the effort is trying to make women's voices heard already. And so, yes, it is going to help in achieving this ambition. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stella. Thomas, I have one more question for you. So how do you think this type of approach can inform the implementation of the priority on gender, vulnerable groups, and youth in Kenya's NAP, National Adaptation Plan?
Yeah, thank you very much. Our process of developing a NAP, the National Adaptation Plan, should be a document that responds to the needs of the people. And what better way to get the needs of the people rather than getting them from the very people who are very vulnerable. And of course, getting this information, seeing the impacts and seeing those solutions now opens up your mind, even as we design the priorities for the next few years to come. You're informed by exactly what's happening on the ground. And also the fact that this is coming from the most vulnerable category of the society, then definitely it means you'll be capture their priorities and needs in the NAP. And when it comes to implementation, it's one way to develop a very good document, it's another to implement. And once you have these stories, you have these issues being raised, then you even know who to target. And of course, you reach to the most vulnerable, because you have a targeted approach to your interventions. And through that, you have a very rich document that will outlive the current office holders, and it's immortalized by these very real issues that have come from the ground. And then even in terms of monitoring, it makes it very easy, because you can go back and take a picture from how that situation was and how it is now. I think it's one of the best ways to actually monitor progress and getting actual and real facts from the ground. So I think it cuts across all the processes of NAF development, right from the identifying the problems, implementation, to the monitoring and evaluation. So I'm seeing a whole cycle in the development and implementation of the NAPs through this process of engaging the most vulnerable and using the visual, the visual aspects to share exactly what they feel and what they want, how they want to see the impact addressed, and then being part of the identification of the problem and implementation to the monitoring and evaluation.
Thank you, Thomas. And let me thank all of the panelists. You raised really great points. This also a reminder to all of the participants, the recording, well, the session is being recorded, so you will hopefully be able to also get back to the presentation and the webinar and listen back to these raised points. You might have seen in the chat already that Cameron has asked you to share or write any questions you may have for the panelists. We have time now for Q&A, and I will be looking out for questions, them with whoever you choose to address those questions to. So here's a question that I think is addressed to all. So food security is deteriorating in West Africa. How can this be addressed if women farmers have few resources to adapt and remain economically invisible? Perhaps a question for our policymakers, actually.
We are seeing frequent intense droughts, and wherever we have floods, it destroys cropland and the livelihoods. And there's need to have very specific interventions because of the very nature of agriculture. It's about food security. It's connected direct to the lives and livelihoods of people. And as we craft and develop our policy and interventions on adaptation, we should come up with the climate smart intervention. How do we make sure that we increase food productivity in a changing climate? And that's why we should start doing things differently. And I'm seeing the role of technology coming in very handy. Go to move from rain-fed agriculture to irrigated agriculture. How do we do in a way that we meet emissions and yet we have more productivity? So, and that's how now we come up with the issues of using clean energy, even to pump water. We use more efficient systems that make sure that you use little water and you get more, just because of the scarcity of water in a changing climate. So there's a whole range of climate smart agriculture technologies and practices that now should be adopted more going forward to make sure that we're able to cope with the vagaries of extreme weather, and ensure that we continue producing enough. And one of the most important category of community that plays a critical role in this area of food security is the women. So having the women in the front line in addressing issues of agriculture, adopting new technologies, will be a sure bet in terms of ensuring that we have more food, even as the impacts become obvious and more intense. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Let me thank Stephanie for the kind words in the chat. We also have a question for Stella. So Stella, could you say more about gender inclusion in Ghana's NAP process, please? So can you say more about gender inclusion in Ghana's NAP process? Thanks.
Okay, so gender inclusion in Ghana's NAP process. So yes, the NAP process had made adequate provision for gender inclusion. And then in this way, you know, we are working with the sub-national structures. And then we are mainstreaming gender in all activities. We're making sure that gender is mainstreamed in the NAP process. And this is consciously being worked on. And so in our district assemblies, when we have gone to our sub-national structures where developmental activities start, yes, there's constant awareness creation and training for them to be conscious of the fact that gender inclusiveness is more critical in this process. And so yes, gender inclusion, the NAP process is taking it to the highest level that it deserves. And that is where Lensational's program becomes more critical here, when we think that it's going to make it, it's going to elevate it more, and then have the influential impact that we think that it deserves. And like I said, sometimes pictures with tying into the question that was asked on food security. I do not want to go directly with the measures that have been put in place over time. There are people who don't even, the contributors of this problem sometimes do not even understand how their contributions, how their activities are contributing to some of these impacts. And so yes, when you have stories that is telling them, this is what is happening, this is what is doing, this is where it's going to lead you, and you're able to compare situations, I think that it will have a very impactful meaning. Sometimes you even need to take a picture to say that, no, my chicks are even growing bigger or leaner, even though somebody might have told you, but you have not seen exactly the way it is. So I think that connecting with it, this is going to give it the impactful measures that is being put in place in the NAP process. Thank you.
Thanks, Stella. Lydia, we got a question for you here. So is it a goal of Lensational to prepare participants to establish careers as photographers? Or perhaps also, you know, helping them document climate and environment stories other than their own? Is Lensational preparing them to do so?
Thank you for that question. This is a really great question. And maybe I can give some context about how we select participants for the programs that we run. So to say that their stories are the stories that the environment and climate stories they're telling are not their own would not be entirely true. Because we work with women who are feeling the impacts of climate change and environmental change, and who want to do something about it and desire to use photography as a tool. Therefore, while selecting for a very specific program such as this partnership, we put that into consideration, that number one, in addition to our photographers being interested and keen, well, with the participants or the trainees that we work being interested in having careers in photography, that some of the issues they would love to raise are around the climate and environmental situations that they come from. Therefore, we prepare them for a career in photography through their own stories that are related in climate and environmental issues. I think that's the best way to answer that. And specifically for this partnership, that's where they're specifically working on the issues of climate change and the environment. So it's their own stories. They're developing their craft in photography while telling these stories that are around climate change and the environment. I hope that answers your question, Matthew.
Thanks, Lydia. Another great question from Gabrielle, which I might generalize. So well, first of all, the question reads, so has any concrete institutional policy change already been triggered out of sharing these pictures in Ghana? So, but just more generally, what concrete institutional policy do you see being triggered out of sharing these pictures? So in general, but I guess, Stella, you can first address this question, but I would like to open it to the other panelists. I think it's a really good question.
Okay, so this is an opportunity we have had for the first time, yet to even have the opportunity to see these ladies who have been trained in this initiative to tell their stories. We have invited some key policy decision makers to this program that is upcoming. And then that is where we hope to initiate our conversations and then to move on whatever policy directions we anticipate. The NAP process itself is actually trying to bring out a climate change bill. And I think we have policy documentations to dialogue with our policymakers. And so this is where the integration of this photographic storytelling comes in, where it will be more impactful when we are telling your stories on why there is a need for a climate change bill on this. And this time's evidence, pictorials, the critical aspect of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Stella. Angie, Thomas, do you have any other thoughts on this question?
Well, I think just to recognize that the dialogue in Kenya only happened on Monday, and the one in Ghana hasn't actually happened yet. It will happen on Friday. So it's maybe a little bit too early to be talking about concrete institutional or policy changes. But from my perspective, the mere fact of getting decision makers in the room and having the dialogue is already an extremely positive step forward in terms of how policymakers are thinking about adaptation, and what, you know, we've heard from Thomas, the impact that it had on him to have that dialogue, and how Stella is looking forward to the dialogue on Friday, and the potential, I think, that is seen in both countries for this to become part of sort of how to take conversations forward and decision-making forward on climate change. For me, that's already a very exciting result. And I guess watch this space. We'll be continuing to work with the governments of Ghana and Kenya to see, you know, how we can take this forward, both through your own initiatives and through support that the Global Network and Lensational may be able to provide.
Thank you, Angie. I think we have time for perhaps one or two more questions. Let me follow up on one point that that Thomas made. So, I thought it was really great when you talked about, you know, this project being linked to linking to all aspects of the adaptation cycle. And how do you think we could use photos for monitoring adaptation? Actually, is that something you could elaborate?
Yes, David, I can elaborate further. You know, in adaptation, one area that we've been struggling globally on is on M&E of adaptation. And, you know, an M&E is basically having a baseline, and then after some time you come back and say, you are here and you want to measure how far you've made progress. And I'm seeing how pictures can play a critical role in this sense, because in case you are to build resilience of an ecosystem like forest ecosystem, and you have done, it was a degraded forest, it's always good to have a picture before, and maybe after your interventions, 5, 6 years down the line, you can come back and take another picture of the same place. And from there you can, prove beyond any reasonable doubt that there's some progress of that intervention. I've just given an example on the forestry, but even land degradation, it's always very good to have evidence of progress, and pictures will definitely play a critical role in this, in proving that those progress that has happened here, either positively or negatively. That's an opportunity I'm seeing also in using visuals like photos to enhance M&E.
Great, thank you. Oh, here's a fun one. To all the panelists, if you could use one word to describe the impact of storytelling, what would it be?
Influential.
I would go with empathy, for sure.
Profound.
10 out of 10. Good words. But maybe, Nimrita, you can rank or rate those answers in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Conscious of time, I think we might. There's one last question that maybe one of you could pick on in the panel. So I just wanted to know, out of personal interest, so what are your hopes for the future of this type of initiative?
So I have hopes. This is micro, and then I am looking forward to, I know it's going to attain the impact it deserves. I'm looking for an upscale where we can bring in more women so that these women who are brought on board will be able to anchor the many yet untold stories. And my stress is the many yet untold stories. And if these are done, it will bring out the realities on the ground. And then that can even initiate, if we do, let's say that if we don't even have anything at all, it can initiate some kind of discussions and where some ears will be given to the underrepresented. And then we hope that it will aid on and go on to activate very responsive decision taking and making. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stella. Yes, Thomas, I think you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I think it is, the future is bright. I'm seeing building on this foundation to improve this further into digital content that you can use to reach many people and pass information to the masses, and even being more innovative and in taking this up to even developing some short videos by the communities themselves and sharing it out through YouTube or Twitter, Facebook, and of course trigger action from more people on the need to take action on climate change.
Thank you, Thomas, for those optimistic and powerful words. So with that, we'll close the webinar. I want to thank you. Huge thanks to our partners in the project for the collaboration on the initiative and on this event. We're really grateful to our trainees who have approached this project really with courage and curiosity, but also to the trainers who have been working with them over the last several months. I also like to extend a huge thanks to our videographers in Ghana and Kenya, and particularly to our colleague Cesar, who put together the video you saw earlier in a very short time, and he did a fantastic job. And we'd encourage to join the NAP Global Network and follow us on social media for updates, as well as Lensational. You can see the links on the screen. And that's really it from me. Thank you. And thanks for being here today. Have a great rest of the day.